Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report. As COVID cases rise and hospitals reach capacity, leaders across the state call for increased restrictions. Utah's final election results are officially certified, confirming winners in many close races. And new leaders reveal their plans to tackle tough issues as they prepare to take office. Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Lad Egan, political reporter with KSL. Kate Bradshaw, Director of Government Affairs at Holland and Hart, and Bountiful City Councilwoman. And we have Ben Winslow, reporter with Fox 13 News. Thank you all for being with us. We've got to get right into the issue that every Utahns talking about, everyone in the country is talking about, the state's response, ours in particular, Ben, to coronavirus, to the impacts. So the governor had a news conference just yesterday. You were there. He's talking about some of the restrictions as we get ready to go into the holiday. Please talk about what some of those are.
Well, the safest way to gather with your family is just don't. Really. Just gather with only the people that you live in your household with. That's the recommendation from the State Department of Health, the COVID-19 Unified Command, and the governor. If you're going to do it, there's other things you need to do. Stay physically distant, even inside your home. Keep it small, keep it short. Have one person prepare the food, masked, serve the food as well. Don't pass the plate, don't pass the dish. If you can hold it outdoors, hey, that's even better. Make sure there's plenty of ventilation. But medical experts and even the governor said, look, the easiest way to do this, and we know it's hard for everybody, you want to get together, this is not the time to do that when we have cases at an all-time high. So just keep it to your own household and talk to everybody on Zoom.
Yeah. So, okay, this is interesting because the restrictions come right before Thanksgiving. There were a lot of people who felt like the harsher restrictions should have stayed in place and not loosen them up a little bit for Thanksgiving.
You know, the governor is in a tricky spot. He's balancing areas along the Wasatch Front that are hitting hospital capacity, and that is very scary. And then he's balancing more rural areas of the state that aren't seeing it in quite the same way. And he's got a little bit of a legislative rebellion going as well. And so it's put him in a difficult spot of trying to manage that middle. At my house, we're looking forward to what we're calling Steaksgiving, and it'll just be our small little family.
With steaks.
Not a big turkey fan, and I'm really not great at cooking it, so we're modifying this year in the tradition of 2020.
Yeah. So Lad, we were just hearing a little bit about some of these conflicts with our legislature, which seems to be brewing a little bit now too. But particularly some of the more conservative elements of our Republican Party are kind of going after the governor, saying these are, even if they're appropriate for some of these things, you should not have the power to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, and that debate is waging on, and particularly in my report yesterday, we're seeing that this debate is particularly strong amongst the school districts, and the Utah Education Association feels like the governor ignored their request to move some secondary schools online. They're in high transmission areas when he came out with his emergency declaration 2 weeks ago, and now they're surveying their teachers, trying to figure out what's next in terms of what to do with schools. They say teachers are feeling overwhelmed with trying to balance that online and also in-person teaching. And actually, in one of their surveys that they sent out yesterday to all the member teachers in their union, asked about some sort of a work stoppage. Would they support a sick out, a way to get the governor's attention?
Wow. So, okay, that is true. And you have to hear from these folks in your elected position also.
I do. I mean, I hear from them as a city council member. I also have a spouse that is a teacher, a high school teacher, and his high school is currently on an online closure. It's been a tough year for teachers. They've had to adapt quickly. They've been teaching more because sometimes they're doing remote learning for kids on quarantine. They've been in person in the classroom. Now they've switched to online. It's been a very difficult year, and it's been a difficult year at our house because of that as well. You know, teachers are doing their best, parents are doing their best, and kids are doing their best. But it's definitely a challenge that I think we're going to see probably more action on after Thanksgiving. It feels a little bit like we're all holding our breath to see if we can handle Thanksgiving. After every holiday, we've seen a bit of a spike. perhaps if we can get through Thanksgiving without a spike, then maybe our education options look different. If we have a big spike, then I think the governor will probably have to look a little more closely at some of those things the UEA is asking for.
Mm-hmm. So Ben, I want to get to one of these points of the restrictions that have stayed in place. I have to ask you, because you have the best masks in the whole state of Utah routinely, but the mask mandate did not go away, all right? That's one thing the governor is keeping in place.
Right. What he did is, for Thanksgiving, he amended the public health order, which goes into effect, or expires Monday, and then the new public health order is going to effect the next day. He raised the limit on social gatherings. Right now, you can't gather with anybody, or you're strongly encouraged or recommended to not gather with anybody outside your own household. That will be lifted so that, if people want to get together for Thanksgiving, they can. But again, the same things that I talked about earlier remain in place. The mask mandate, that's going to stay, and that may stay essentially till further notice. We haven't seen the new public health order. We don't know when the expiration date is. The state epidemiologist, Dr. Angela Dunn, had said that in a briefing before the Health and Human Services Committee that really, if we were still on the transmission index, that scale of which counties are high, medium, low, only 3 counties in Utah right now would not be in the high category. Pretty much the entire state is in the high-risk category for COVID-19. That's why you're seeing a lot of these public health orders staying. Another thing that's going to stay in place is bars having last call at 10 o'clock. I know there's been a lot of restaurants and bars that have been very upset about that. The goal of that by the health department is to limit gatherings, just to stop people from congregating in places. So if you have last call early, go home. That's kind of the goal of this, without mandating it necessarily.
Ladd, one of the interesting points to these great points that Ben just made is how we're starting to see Republican governors across the country starting to institute some of these mask mandates. We saw it last week in Massachusetts. Our own governor has done this as well. Is this a sign that maybe even that one issue is becoming less about politics, a little more about public health, or is that still just raging on as it has been so far?
I think the debate rages on, especially you kind of have a rural-urban divide and a political divide on that. But I think with us getting past the election, we are seeing that maybe these Republican governors are more likely to do that with maybe the political climate, the temperature being dialed down just a little bit. But definitely, I think the debate rages on in terms of people's personal opinions about it. But as the science becomes more clear that wearing masks protects not only the wearer but those around them, and that in conjunction with social distancing and the other measures can help slow the spread. And I know in Utah, a lot of the discussion that the health department and the hospital association is trying to help people understand is when they were saying our ICU beds were 85% full, many thought, well, there's still 15% more beds to be had. And they're saying, no, at 85%, especially in our 16 referral hospitals that are best equipped to take care of the COVID patients, that when they reach that 85% capacity, they are functionally full. That's all they have the staff for. And that when they get to that point, the rural hospitals can't send their sickest patients to these better hospitals. And so they're trying to educate us on what that means and what it means for everybody wearing a mask, that you're protecting the hospital system, not just for those that are in the hospital with coronavirus, but those that need to go to the ICU for a heart attack or a trauma, that you want to make sure there are those beds available. And this week we teetered close to 90% functionally full for those 16 referral center hospitals.
And we've gone even further than that. University Hospital exceeded 100%.
Wow.
Yeah, these hospitals are full. You have to manage this even in one of your assignments, right, Kate?
It's true. By virtue of kind of my city council assignment, I serve on the hospital board for a local hospital in Bountiful. And so it's one of those things that has been a bit of a heavy assignment this year, to be very aware early on of the impact of kind of closing all those elective procedures in order to secure and save PPE, to do the engineering on ICU floors so that you could expand them, and then to, quite frankly, prepare and watch for what we're seeing now. The hospitals and their staffs are stretched, and the staff are worried. And we're asking a lot of them right now, and we're asking a lot of their families. And so it seems to me that the very simplest thing that each of us could do would just just be to wear our masks. They could be fashion masks, like Ben is a fan of. I have gone for more the comfort masks. The more comfortable, the better, even if they're less fashionable. But something so simple will really help our hospitals.
What's so interesting to this issue, as we talk about taking the politics out of at least that issue and about this common enemy that we all have in the coronavirus, Ben, our own Governor Gary Herbert just yesterday had a call with the National Governors Association with President-elect Joe Biden to talk about how we do this very issue. Just a couple points about what you heard from that call and the impact of vaccines as we're hearing it coming through the country into the state.
Right. I mean, the vaccine is coming. There is a slight light at the end of the tunnel, but realistically, you have to temper expectations. It's going to be July before most Utahns have access to this. They are prioritizing who gets it because we don't know how many doses we're going to get. We don't know. Is this going to be something that works long term? Are we going to need to keep doing this? We don't know if it has sterilizing immunity or if it's like the flu shot. Everybody's just trying to figure out how we're going to be able to do this. And so there's that. Then the governor expressed his desire to continue to let states make decisions based upon what's best for their communities versus a national mandate. And the governor certainly said that he hopes that President-elect Biden, and he called him that,
he did.
Allows for state decisions versus national decisions, a national mandate. There's been a lot of discussion about a national mask mandate. There's been a lot of people who are concerned about how vaccines are distributed, whether everybody has to get a vaccine, how that's going to work. And the governor obviously wants it to be very much more of a local issue.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. In fact, putting together a local vaccine plan for the state of Utah, which is important as well. Can we get into the certification of elections?
That feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, can you believe that? But we're still talking about. So this week we finally had the certification. So the people we thought were going to win, it's all certified has happened. We had a really great turnout here in the state of Utah. Kate, we hit 68%. This is the highest since 1976, which is when we hit 70%.
It's amazing. I get to serve, because of my local government position on a board of canvassers. So we had a bond election in addition. So I got to serve on that board of canvassers. It was so interesting to receive those reports, see who forgot to sign their ballot, who had an opportunity to cure their ballots. There were a few dead people that tried to vote that were caught. So that was a very interesting insight that for the first time that I was able to do. And the turnout was amazing. Overall, the statewide turnout was fantastic. The turnout for our bond election in just the city of Bountiful was 91%. It's amazing. No one could ever remember it being that high. So a lot of positives, I think, for our election. But obviously, this was a tough year election-wise. Perhaps it's helpful that maybe we're spending Thanksgiving in a smaller way, so we don't have to continue to have these dicey family discussions about the election outcome.
Okay. I can only imagine the discussions at your house, Kate. Okay.
They're entertaining.
Okay. Lad, I want to get into one of the races where this turnout had just an enormous outsized impact. This is on the 4th Congressional District. After the final canvass here, Burgess Owens won by 3,765 votes. That's 1%. Let's talk about how this race this year was a little different than the last race where Ben McAdams won by, less than 700 votes.
And that's the trouble with this district, is that it's a relatively new district. And so we look to the past to figure out what's going to play out this time. And it keeps on being different. Turnout was definitely a factor this time around with Republican Burgess Owens winning. Utah County had excellent turnout. They didn't have the trouble that they had back in 2018. You'll remember it was after 2018 that the governor called Utah County the epicenter of dysfunction when it comes to problems on election day. They have a new county clerk auditor down there. They have a new elections director, and they really ramped it up and made sure things went smoothly. So turnout in Utah County turned out to be a lot better, and that helped out Burgess Owens. And then in Salt Lake County, they feel like some of the precincts that would have helped Ben McAdams didn't turn out like they needed to, or like they did back in 2018. Also, we didn't have some of these initiatives on the ballot, like Medicaid expansion or medical marijuana. And back in 2018, when a lot of people showed up and registered same day on those provisional ballots, those went in favor of Ben McAdams. And this time, that just did not happen.
Okay, so a couple really great points in there. Of course, when we're talking about these turnout percentages, these are the percentages of registered voters. all right, which is just enormous all by itself because we want everyone to register to vote. But Lad was just talking about a couple issues that really helped Ben in 2018. And sometimes these are about initiatives, right? Not necessarily just about the candidates. Go ahead, Ben.
Hot drives polls. And that's what happened in 2018. You saw voters very energized about the ballot initiatives. They didn't materialize this time. Republicans did turn out. Republicans turned out in Utah County in droves. In 2018, what we saw was people waiting in line, getting so frustrated by waiting in line to vote. After waiting in line for hours, they went home. That certainly advantaged the Democrat. But what we saw in this instance, there was a lot more reliance on vote by mail, a lot more messaging to get out, more people turned out, and obviously it was more turnout for the Republicans.
Yeah, to Ben's point, so Utah County itself, 89% turnout of registered voters, which they did not have an option to do. Well, they had the option, but a lot of people went home in the last election in Utah County. So many problems, as Lad was just talking about. But this time, Utah County really came through, and on this time it went for the Republicans. Kate, why did we not see as great a turnout? Well, that's not right. We saw a great turnout in Salt Lake County also, but this time not for the Democratic candidate.
That's true, and I think a lot of credit does go to the Utah County Clerk. She did a lot of things to make voting more accessible and easier for the people of Utah County. And so that changed. And then, of course, we've had the extra emphasis this year of using the mail-in voting system, which most Utahns are very familiar with and we're comfortable with as a state. So that definitely made it easier for the Utah County voter to turn out than it had in the prior election. You know, the lack of ballot initiatives is an interesting phenomenon. You know, there's been a lot of work and analysis done on the impact the two ballot initiatives Ben mentioned, Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana had. There were potentials for ballot initiatives to be on the 2020 ballot. There was a carbon tax issue that was tried and didn't meet the signature threshold. And there was one that I was involved in that ended up settling in a legislative compromise on the issue of 3-2 beer. Had that not been a compromise in the legislative session, it likely also would have been on the 2020 ballot. And that might have driven a Salt Lake County voter in a different way, just as the carbon tax issue might have also driven a Salt Lake County voter in a different way than perhaps a Utah County voter.
Very interesting.
And it wasn't just beer. It would have been wine, too.
Beer and wine.
It likely would have been a more expansive ballot initiative if not for that legislative compromise in the 19 legislative session.
So that could have, if this was on the ballot this time, that could have impacted that Salt Lake County vote.
It could have been a very interesting factor in the election, in my opinion, because of what we saw 2 years earlier with these other two issues that drove a more Democratic voter out to the polls in this interesting mishmash we have in the 4th District between Utah County and Salt Lake County.
So, Lad, there was one other initiative that we voted on last time, too, the Independent Redistricting Commission. Interesting because, this district, the 4th Congressional District, I'm not sure it was ever drawn in a way that was supposed to make it easy on Democrats to win. So I guess the curious question is whether or not our legislature is going to try to address it yet again.
And that's, I think, the worry for Democrats. This district pulled in, rural, Juab, Sanpete counties and Utah County that is becoming more urban, and then parts of Salt Lake County that are urban. And we've seen that it is a battleground district. And Ben McAdams talked about that he wished Democrats on the national level would think more about districts like his that can go either way and how to appeal to those voters. But the issue is, could it be changed to further solidify a Republican base there? We know now with Burgess Owens' win that Utah's congressional delegation, the lone Democrat will be gone and it will be all Republican again.
So the impact of turnout, it's just so good to have this kind of turnout in every kind of election. But Kate, there were some impacts on our very local elected officials as well. Talk about a couple of those. We had several races that were won by less than 200 votes.
Yeah, in the Utah legislature, there's a handful of seats that are always interesting to watch, particularly in Salt Lake County. And several of them for a couple election cycles have been very narrow victories or defeats. Representative Craig Hall, his was one that was very close, was watched all the way until the final canvass. Representative Jim Dunnigan was another one that was very, very close, and he managed to hang on. Representative Steve Elison, he looked like he was going to be down and lose, and slowly, as more votes were counted through the canvass, came back. And then, of course, there's a one seat pickup for the Utah Democratic Party in our state house. Representative Hutchings had served for a long time and lost to Ashley Matthews. So if you got a little tired of national politics, there were some really interesting local races that were neck and neck all the way through the election cycle and through this final counting, where the daily data dumps were moving people up and down on who was ahead.
So amazing. I know all of us were watching the screen every few minutes, pushing refresh to see those come in. Interesting impact. Shireen Gorbani with the county council.
That was certainly something that it flipped. It did, and there was a lot of seats in Salt Lake County government, particularly, that it looked like going into the election, the Democrats were going to dominate, that you expected that Biden-Harris kind of train that you would see. But then as the results came in and you saw more turnout by Republicans, and the Republicans really turned out in Salt Lake County. I think a lot of people expected Salt Lake County itself would just go blue, and it's still really, really purple. You have a Republican majority, you have a Republican supermajority now on the county council, but you have a Democratic mayor. You have obviously Salt Lake County went overwhelmingly for Biden in the election. So there's a lot to just really unpack there, and I think all of us are going to be analyzing this in the months to come to see how this works, because it does appear that there was some split ticketing going on, that people may not have been necessarily satisfied with President Trump in Salt Lake County, but they certainly liked their local Republican leadership and their elected officials that they chose.
So interesting to see that did happen, because, of course, this is the first election we had in Utah where you could not do a straight party ticket, which meant every person had to go through person by person. And it's interesting, to your great point as well, that it's not just the turnout in Salt Lake County that mattered right here. It's where in Salt Lake County those people were showing up. It ended up being a big deciding factor. Since we're talking about elections, I want to take just a moment about how Utah is getting involved in this big picture conversation about election fraud. Okay, because this, the president of the United States is still going strong in the assertions about there's some wide-scale voter fraud, but we're really not seeing that come to fruition. What are our local elected officials saying about this?
The lieutenant governor, our new governor-elect, Spencer Cox, he has been pretty vocal, and because his job as lieutenant governor was to be over elections, he's very familiar with our election process, and he's been a defender, saying that, of course, Utah's elections were fraud-free. We're comfortable with mail-in balloting, but you've seen a split in our U.S. senators representing Utah in terms of whether they believe that there was fraud, or whether we should continue to play out some of these challenges that President Trump is moving forward. It's been an interesting experience, and I think for most voters, for most of our lives, we've probably kind of known on election day. If you stayed up late enough, at 2 a.m, you'd know. But we've all learned a lot more about how canvasses work, how curing ballots work. I think that's probably good for us. I think maybe your average voter didn't know much about that process, and this election cycle will mean that we can never claim we don't know how the canvasses work, and how they're a little bit unique in each state, and how the states have their own process for how they manage elections, and everyone's a little bit different. We really love mail-in balloting. Some other states, not so much.
Yeah, we do. And I want to talk about what our elected officials, and you mentioned Mitt Romney and Senator Mike Lee, our two senators, have had a couple things to say about this. Ben, but I'm curious about how strong Mitt Romney has been this week. All right.
Last night's tweet?
Yeah, so I'm just so curious, because I want to kind of show the difference between these two things. So the Utah Republican Party put out a statement saying...
Yes. Essentially, that they want, it's parroting a lot of the National Republican Party line, which is, let's see how this plays out. Let's thoroughly investigate. Let's vet these things. Yeah. Despite court challenge after court challenge after court challenge, just falling apart. They kind of sided with the president there. Then a few hours later, Senator Romney put out a tweet and basically went after the president.
Yeah,
and it was a little bit of a subtweet on the Republican Party of Utah, too.
Yeah, it kind of was, too. I want to read that because it was just so important to get the difference between these two approaches. He's a Republican. Mitt Romney is a Republican, but as a response. So, Lad, I want to read this quote to you and get your take on it as well about the impact from Senator Mitt Romney. He said, having failed to make even a plausible case of widespread fraud or conspiracy before any court of law, the president has now resorted to to overt pressure on state and local officials to subvert the will of the people and overturn the election. It is difficult to imagine a worse, more undemocratic action by a sitting American president. Wow, that's serious.
Yeah, that is serious. And, after the election, Mitt Romney had a discussion, a conference call with reporters where he talked about the openness. If there are irregularities, they should be investigated. But the problem all along has been the actual evidence. The Trump attorneys will argue that the people won't come forward right now because they're afraid, but there are affidavits that exist here. But that's been the threshold everyone's been asking for is where is that evidence? And some of the problem that we're seeing right now is as the states are starting to certify their results, that this effort is ongoing. And today we know that Trump has invited representatives from Michigan State House and Senate to come to the White House, and that's where Romney's talking about is this pressure on them to somehow have influence over the results of the election in that state.
Okay, so what do you think? The statement from the Utah Republican Party right then, what you were saying, these things should be looked at, they should be investigated, and if necessary, litigated. Is this the result, do you think, of pressure coming from the Trump administration or others on the Republican Party?
It's hard to think that there's not a little bit of pressure coming because, as Ben mentioned, there's these court challenges in different states have gone up and they've fallen apart in courts. They haven't had the evidence they've said they've had. They've repeated these very damning allegations, but they haven't had evidence to back it up. And I think there's a little bit of worry that you can't just cry wolf and not feel like that's not going to have an impact on the system. We have over 250 years of peaceful transitions of power as the hallmark of our system, and to think that might not happen is scary to me personally, and I think it's scary to our markets and all kinds of things. Integrity of elections is incredibly important. We should check that out, but you also have to be careful that you're not throwing out allegations that are unfounded.
Yeah, we'll be watching this one closely as it develops. Thank you all for your great analysis tonight. So helpful, and we're better informed because of you, so thank you. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.